Hey guys, welcome to my channel. Today we're going to paint a delicious red velvet cupcake. Let's jump in. For my paper today, I'm using Fluid 100. It's a 4x6" block of watercolor paper. It is 140-pound cold pressed. And to start the sketch, I'm just making some very light markings indicating the outside edges of the cupcake. I want to make sure that it's not going to be too large or too small, that it's just centered nicely on the paper. And it's important when you're starting your sketch to sketch very lightly because rarely do we get it right the first time. So that way you can erase easily and quickly. Once you're more confident with your initial marks, then you can go in and darken up your lines, correcting any edges that you'd like. Here I'm erasing some of those extra marks. And so I've just drawn the outside shape of the cupcake. You can see those outer edges kind of angle in towards the center. Now the most challenging thing to draw is going to be the shape of the frosting on the cupcake. You can see it's just these wonderful white swirls coming towards the center. And it's okay if these aren't perfect. Just try to get the basic lines down. I'm trying to make sure that the little point at the top is exactly in the center of the cupcake. And there's a nice curving line coming down, almost like a slide from the center. And then you've got these different levels of frosting. Correcting that edge and making that one just a little wider. And so from the center, there's just two layers of frosting. One is very large and the other is very skinny on the far right. Trying to make those really smooth. And then on the left side of the center of the cupcake, those curves don't really come up all the way to the point. They come up a little ways and then stop. And we've got two rounded shapes where the frosting is kind of curving. The base of the frosting curves up. And then here at the base of the cupcake, I'm showing where the paper portion of the cupcake touches the frosting and just carefully indicating the top part of that paper cup with these upside down curves or half circles. I want to make sure that my sketch on the paper portion of the cupcake is accurate because there's going to be a lot of light and shadow shapes within this part of the painting. So I'm getting all of the shadow shapes drawn on just so I know where I can avoid the light shapes and also where I can apply more paint and go darker in the shadows. If you're not comfortable with the sketching portion of this cupcake tutorial, of course, I do have a line drawing you can download below. So you can go ahead and check that out. And if you need to, you can print that and use the transfer paper method, or you can just trace it on. But this is a pretty easy subject, I think, to sketch. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's just a cupcake. So I would say go for it, give it a shot, do your best. Any chance you get to practice your sketching is only going to improve your drawing skills and also your painting skills because even when you're painting, you're still drawing. So there we've got all of those curved vertical lines roughly sketched on for our cupcake. And we have just enough information so we can begin painting. I'm going to be using my Tracy LaBenson soft white synthetic Wangi bamboo handle brush today. This one is a nice springy synthetic brush and it's going to be great for all the details in this small painting. I've got my water jar, I've got a towel for blotting, and the two reds I have on my palette that I'm going to be combining for the red velvet color are alizarin crimson, that's this cranberry color right here, and cadmium red light. So the alizarin crimson is a Holbein color, but you can get that in just about any brand, and cadmium red as well. So I felt like both of those colors on their own weren't quite right, so I decided to combine the two, and I was really happy with the combination. I'm going to be using my even smaller synthetic brush here. This one has really nice stiff bristles, And this is the small stiff white synthetic brush by Lebenzen. And I'm going to be switching back and forth here between the two brushes because with one, I'm applying a thick layer of paint. And then with the smaller, stiffer one, I'm just using clean water and kind of pulling some of that paint up and away to help blend it into the paper. This is another method you can use for blending. If you're struggling with going from dark to light or creating a gradient in your watercolor paint, it's sometimes helpful to use two brushes. So I'm using the thick paint on this larger brush, and then I'm switching to my smaller one, wetting it first, and then smoothing that out, pulling some of that paint in a lighter value into the white portion of the paper on the cupcake. Switching back to my pigmented larger brush. Right now, I'm just painting in all of those dark shadow shapes in between where the paper is protruding forward. Some of the paper, of course, is not directly touching the cake, such as those curves you see coming around the top of the paper cup. And so those are going to be almost white and much lighter in value. So I'm really just painting the shadows, the portion of the cupcake paper that's touching the cake itself and is therefore darker because of that. Carefully pulling my brush downward towards the base of the cupcake, switching to my smaller one and blending that edge. Rinsing again and smoothing out the bottom. One of my marks came a little too far down. And continuing on, I'm moving from left to right because I'm right-handed. This just makes sense. And in my reference photo, you'll see a little wiggle in the paper there. So I'm actually kind of imitating that with the motion of my brush, wiggling my brush to create a ridged edge along that white paper. Switching to my smaller one again and blending that out. We don't want the white paper portion of the cup to be completely white. That wouldn't look natural. It would look a little too stark against that dark red. So this is helping blend that a little better. You may have to continually mix up more pigment as you work. Before we go on, if you're finding this video helpful, please leave me a comment below and hit that like button. This really helps me out as a creator to be able to find new ways to improve my videos and to continue to bring you guys great free content like this. So thank you. So continue following this pattern, creating this curved shape at the top of that shadow and then pulling it down. And all of that red connects at the bottom because at the bottom portion of the cupcake, the cake itself is pushed up into the paper, and so it's all dark against that paper. You may have to dip your brush in the water to get your paint flowing smoothly for you. And here I am mixing up some more in my palette. It dries out so fast too. And if you want to make your cupcake even more perfect than the reference photo, by all means, you can even out these ridges in the cupcake. You can make them all perfectly even, all the same size. And then it'll look even more like an illustration or an idealized version of your red velvet cupcake. That's also an option. I'm just trying to follow my reference photo as closely as possible. So the paper on the cupcake, it's not perfect. Some of the ridges are smaller and wider than others. Just trying to paint what I see. As I'm moving towards the right of the cupcake, it's getting a little bit darker in value, and I'm trying to imitate that with how much pigment I'm putting on my brush. Once again, I've switched to that smaller brush and I'm smoothing out the edge just with clean water, stroking the edge between the paper that's dry and the paper that's wet with paint, and that's helping it blend. Try not to get lost in the shapes here. If you did an accurate sketch, you should be able to find certain points where you know it's correct and you can just move from there. It's easy when you're working on a pattern shape like this to kind of get lost in those details and lose sight of where you are in comparison to the reference photo, but just do your best. You'll want to be the most careful along edges like the bottom and along the right and left sides. Those edges are permanent marks after all. Of course, you can try to smooth them out, but if you end up overextending your paint or coloring outside of the lines, it can be a little bit tricky to fix. So just go slow enough and carefully enough that that doesn't happen. You'll want to make sure you're resting your hand on something. All right, so now I have Moonglow on my palette here. It's this wonderful tritone color. It's a combination of red, green, and gray, and it ends up being this beautiful purple color. And I'm using a very watered down mixture of this. This is going to be the shadow tone in this painting. So I'm using that along the paper portion of the cup at the very top where it meets the frosting, and filling in the shadow shapes, still leaving some highlights in between where the paper is completely white. This is really just helping reinforce the shadows towards the top of the cupcake without being pure red, because after all, in this portion, the cake isn't necessarily touching the paper in all of these sections. And so we want it to look like it's papery thin, that it's just this white in shadow. You can use a darker, richer pigment of your Moonglow to deepen up the shadows in between the red divots in the cupcake. That's what I'm doing here. I'm painting an even darker shadow in the center of each one. As you come towards the bottom, feather your brush up and away. You don't want that black to extend all the way to the bottom. I say black. It looks black when you put it down in its darkest version here, but it's still just Moonglow that I'm using on my brush. And I'm using some more watered down Moonglow to darken up along the bottom of the cupcake. And then with that same color, I'm painting a quick shadow underneath, and I'm raking my brush along the surface of the paper, letting it catch somewhat, and it's creating this really interesting dry brush effect there. And it's also okay to let the Moonglow touch the alizarin crimson and cadmium red combination so that it almost blends into that purple color, lending the look of a reflection of the color on the table surface. And I think that can look really realistic and beautiful. And now I'm continuing to move from left to right, darkening up those shadows with my Moonglow. Use much more watered down paint in the areas that are white, and you can go a lot darker when you're covering up the shadow tones of the red. Moonglow is also the color of choice for my frosting. You'll see in just a bit. You can see I'm just dabbing in the paint directly when I want to go really dark with that color and swiping downward. Oftentimes you can accomplish this with just a single brush stroke. You've done all the hard work already of carefully and painstakingly painting on all that red, and of course the initial sketch took some time as well. And so I've just defined all of the outer edges of the paper portion of the red velvet cupcake, and already we haven't painted any frosting yet, but we can definitely tell what this is. It's really fun and exciting when you reach this point. So now I'm dipping into my alizarin crimson one more time with my larger bamboo handle brush, and I'm going to paint in the cake portion that's just showing underneath the frosting. You want to use a lot of pigment for this part. Make it nice and dark and rich. And I apologize, my camera went out of focus for some of these shots. But you can see the gist of it here. I'm just coloring in the cake portion that we already sketched on with pencil. Working slowly and carefully using the tiny tip of my brush. You'll want a really small brush for these details. And don't water down your paint for this section. You want it to be as dark as possible. You only need enough water to get your paint flowing. Work carefully around those paper portions of the cupcake, painting in between each of those curves. Sometimes it's helpful to think about just outlining the shape that you sketched on and then just filling it in like you're coloring it in once you've done that more difficult part. Fortunately for this painting, our colors are pretty simple. We may end up darkening up the cake portion here after this first layer goes on. But for now, this is just really helping us see the shape of the cupcake and defining the base of the frosting for us. I was messing up my lines a little bit there, so kind of adjusting for that. I decided to switch to my smaller brush for the rest of this. The bristles on this little one are a little bit stiffer and I think work better for these tiny details. So now I'm going to be doing some frosting, and you don't need a whole lot of color. Be careful when you're painting shadow shapes in white frosting that you use very light watered down paint. So with that moon glow, I'm just following the contours of my pencil lines and painting very, very light, almost imperceptible shadows along the edges of those pencil marks. You can see I'm connecting the frosting shape from the center point all the way over to the left, leaving a highlight on the top. Make sure you don't paint in everything. We want the white of the paper to show underneath so that we have a clear sense of the light source coming from up above. On this largest center section of frosting, I'm painting a nice broad shadow, still using my watered down moon glow. Here at the base, I'm letting it touch that alizarin crimson, pulling some of that pink up into the mixture. And this is creating a sense of reflected color coming up, bouncing off the frosting. If it blurs and bleeds out a little bit too much, of course, you can correct that by pulling the paint back out using a clean, damp brush. I think I am going to throw in a little bit of warm color here. This is my Gamboge Nova on my palette. And so with very watered down yellow, I'm adding little hints of that in the frosting along the edges of that moon glow that we just painted. You can kind of see those little hints of yellow in the reference photo too. Smoothing out any of those edges that are getting maybe too hard. And look for color harmony. You'll want to place that yellow all throughout so it doesn't look like it's just placed in certain spots and not others. I was definitely getting hungry while I was painting this. It just looked so delicious. Very good. So there's the frosting. While you have little bits of moon glow on your brush, you can touch up any other shadows you see needing to be darkened in the paper portion of the cupcake, but I'm pretty happy with that. Now before we can add the sprinkles, we need to let that dry. So the cupcake is dried completely now. I'm coming back in with some more pigmented moon glow on my brush, and I am darkening up the cake just underneath the frosting. We want to just give it a little bit more dimension. We want to darken up our darkest values just to give it even more sense of 3D contrast. So I'm correcting any of those rough lines underneath the frosting too. You can see when you paint that moon glow over the top of that dark red, it pretty much almost looks black. It's very, very dark. The advantage to using a color like this or neutral tint or Payne's gray or something like that instead of black is that we are applying paint over the top, and we want that paint to be transparent. It can look a little bit too murky if you're using something like black over the top. Black is completely opaque, so it's going to cover up all those layers you worked so hard on underneath. There's one more little area over here on the right side of the cupcake that I didn't fill in. So I'm correcting that now and just filling that in with my dark moon glow. Work really carefully around those edges. This is the trickiest part of the painting for sure, is working around those bumps along the cupcake paper. And I think that looks better. And now it's time to do the sprinkles. Once again, I followed my reference photo pretty carefully for these, and I'm mixing up that same combination of cadmium red and alizarin crimson. We want to keep the same color all throughout. And I'm just using the tip of this tiny little brush and starting to dab on little sprinkles. If it looks too dark at first, just remember it will dry a little bit lighter than what you're seeing here. So I'm starting with some of the larger clumps of sprinkles. Again, following the contours of those frosting curves, we want it to look like someone just took a little handful of these sprinkles and dropped them straight down. And we want to be true to where gravity would pull them. They would fall, of course, naturally on the flat upturned sides of the frosting. You can apply your sprinkles any way you want. I am making sure that I have a couple that are just standing out over the edges of each level of frosting. Couple on the very top. You want to be aware of the angle you're holding your brush at. When I'm holding mine at an angle like this, it tends to form almost a flat, skinny line with the tip of my brush. So you might want to try different angles and just see what works best for you. This part was so much fun. I think the sprinkles really made it come to life. It looks like we could just pick it up right off the paper and eat it. Of course, add as many or as few sprinkles as you want, but try to be true to the image that you're working from. For example, in real life, you wouldn't see sprinkles all over every square inch, perfectly uniform across the frosting. The sprinkles, as you see here, have fallen naturally on the flat portions of the frosting, and the areas that are turning under don't have any sprinkles on them at all. So you can really just follow the contours of your pencil mark, follow the curves of the frosting. So there is our finished red velvet cupcake, just in time for the holidays. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.